So if you're here, that probably means that you have some writing to do. And it probably also means that you're not particularly excited about it, which has been more or less me for the last 6 weeks or so over the summer. And I got around to bridge the gap between wanting to write and actually writing. So, I figured today I just want to chat a bit to tell you how I did it, what advice I got from the supervisors, and why I think that worked for me. So for this whole thing to make sense perfectly, I want to set the scene about my paper a little bit that I'm working on. So it's a paper in a topic which has been very heavily researched in the last decade or so. It got a lot of attention, which is great. But since it's only been researched a lot in the last decade, that also means that there are a lot of open questions and open directions, and there isn't really a very well integrated framework yet, or very clear questions to continue on. It's just a lot of open questions, a lot of different perspectives, a lot of different ways to look at it, which is very cool. It's super exciting. That's why I enjoy engaging with it. But at the same time, it does carry some of these burdens with it. And to make the matters worse, the rubber is about to hit the road, because by the end of fall, I should have a full paper ready to submit to a conference. So that means that all of my thoughts and ideas and the analysis that I'm building should take form in place of a paper, like a full paper, not just an abstract or not just like a draft, but actually a full written out paper. And that positively terrified me. Okay, so I sat down to write, and it was a huge pain. And I couldn't really put my finger on it because, yeah, of course, I faced some resistance when sitting down to write, and half of that obviously is imposter syndrome and whatever. And the other half is writing is just difficult to form nice sentences and whatnot. But it was a little more because I felt like I couldn't really put my finger on, I felt like I needed to think more to figure out what I wanted to say. And then, once I figured it out, it will be easier to write down. So I thought. I was a bit baffled by this problem because I write a lot and I take a lot of notes. I actually made a video about that, I think, but I document any process I do, and I do take a lot of notes, and those notes are obviously written text. And I also journal a lot, and I do write a lot, but for some reason this writing for argumentation style just felt very different and very difficult to do. I got a bit stuck on it, as as one does in their first year of their PhD. I got stuck. And then what do you do when you're stuck in your first year of your PhD? You go screaming into your supervisor's office, help, please, something. And thankfully, as they were not born yesterday, they had some advice for me. And they gave very interesting advice. To my plea that, oh my god, I cannot figure out what to say, so I can't write, both of them separately gave the advice to write in two different frameworks. And they were super interesting, so I want to tell you about it. One of my supervisors told me to write the paper in 5 bullet points. The draft paper I'm expected to produce should be around, between 20 and 40 pages. I think 40 is the max, and below 20 it has to be really good and really solid. It's not exactly 5 bullet points. And then I just looked at her what do you mean 5 bullet points? And then she said oh yeah, just do an intro, a theory, a methods, results or expected results, and a discussion, and a sentence each, or maybe it can be a paragraph if you really want to push it, to really try to crystallize what you want to say. That was advice number 1, and I will tell you how it went, but I want to give you advice number 2, so keep it nice and coherent. The other was to write an intro, or write an intro structure, and it's the ABCD structure of an intro. So A, the first one, stands for why do we care about this topic? The B is the second one, is what do we already know about this topic? So C is what do we not know about this topic? So any open questions. And then D, the last one, is what am I gonna do about it? And I think that just flows really well. And this is also a pretty natural process in explaining your research to someone. I found myself using this structure quite naturally in conversation when someone asks me about my research. This is more or less how you go about it. So it was very nice and very useful advice. So given those two advices, the 5 bullet points and the ABCD style intro, I sat down to work, and it was hard. I'm sitting on a lot of notes. I have a bunch of notes and read a bunch of papers, and then I thought a lot about this topic. But even just the 5 bullet points, figuring that out took me a solid 2 hours, just sitting there and trying to really put down the sentence. Okay, so what exactly am I trying to say here? And it was really hard. And then after that, I was kind of prepared for the ABCD structure to take even longer, and it did. It took me like a full day to really like synthesize my thoughts from all of my thinking and all of my notes and all of the highlights and literature. But after a day, I went through all of those and also incorporated, the 5 bullet points was a good start because it kind of forced me to actually answer, like not answer, but like answer my own research question in a way, even if it's like a preliminary way. And then the ABCD structure really just like helped craft the argumentation around it. So it was a great experience. And then at the end of the day, I had something. And then, of course, it wasn't complete and it wasn't perfect, but I had words on the page. So it was not an empty page anymore. So at next following meetings with my supervisor, like, okay, like I thought about this and like, does it make sense? Or, should this go into like empirical context within theory, or should I put it in the method section? The answer is usually both. And then from there on, I could interact with my draft. And it just wasn't something scary that I had to write, but like it was actually something tangible. And that was a great experience. Like, writing was not a great experience because it was really hard. But afterwards, once that dam broke, it made it much easier. And then when I had to like actually phrase all my hypotheses, it was much easier because it was already like a big chunk of draft with a lot of like citations in it, and like it just made the whole workflow a bit easier. After this worked really well for me, I sat down to think like, okay, so why did this work so well? And part of it is probably just like getting out of your own way. Like after your supervisors tell you to write, you likely are gonna write. At least I do. But then I started thinking like, oh yeah, maybe there is some like meta thinking going on here. I have my notes, by the way, that's why I'm glancing in that direction. I found an analogy that worked quite well for me, which tied this to journaling. So I'm a huge fan of journaling. Around me there are 1, 2, 3, and then like, I don't know, 5 more notebooks over there. So I cannot think in my head. Anytime I have an experience or a worry or anything, I have to write it down. And like, I have a little tiny notebook that I carry with me. I have a bigger notebook for like bigger thoughts and like more writing. And I had like notebooks dedicated to separate topics, and I journal a lot. And the reason why I do it is when I tell people like why I journal, the reason is that when you are just like thinking about, like, let's use worrying an example. Like there is an issue that just puts a lot of anxiety in you, and like you just worry about it a lot. And then when it's in your head, I think about it as this like big storm cloud of issues. It's just like this big gloomy cloud that you just feel threatened by. But when you start writing it out and like writing out what exactly you're thinking and what your feelings are, it kind of like forces it into shape almost, and then it goes from this like big gloomy cloud into something tangible. And then once it's on the paper, it still might be like a big issue, but at least it's tangible. It's not this like shape-shifting in like, very intangible. I'm saying tangible and intangible. It's not very descriptive. I know, I'm sorry. It's a heat wave. It's the best I can do. It goes from some like this shape-shifting indescribable monstrosity to a problem. And problems you can solve. Or at least you can think about them in a more healthy way, because you can't solve all the problems. Half of the worries I have are not something that I can just like, workshop how to solve. But it just forces them into shape. And I think what is happening here is very similar. Because when you read a lot, especially if it's a topic that you spent a lot of time thinking about, when you read a lot and then you think about it a lot and you discuss it a lot, and maybe you even ran some analysis on it, so you already have some like results in it, like thinking where this could go in the future. Those thoughts are like a big, like bulbous cloud of thoughts. It's not really coherent yet. And as you are forcing it into shape, even if the shape is 5 bullet points, then you kind of are coercing all of these bubbles and this chaos of ideas and facts and statements and questions and challenges into a coherent shape. And of course, it's not going to be perfect, and it's not going to be, it's not done by no stretch of the imagination. But at least it gave it shape. And I think like this is the same process as with journaling. It's really the same, that you just take something that's in your head, this like big chaotic swirling stack of thoughts, feelings, ideas, questions, and then you just turn it into something tangible. Because when you put it down on the page, you kind of freeze a state of that like vortex of thoughts and ideas. And while that might not be the perfect state to freeze it in, at least you can now like actually examine it. And for me, I realized that the preliminary research questions that I phrased were actually at least 3 different research questions. But because in my mind, anytime I thought about one, through like 3 or 4 mental loops, I drew an equivalence to another. But then when I wrote it down, I was like, oh no, these are completely different. And then these are the kind of stuff that you don't really notice when it's just like in your head, or like you might with a lot of practice. So if you practice a lot of this like academic thinking, you might be able to pick up like, in your head, find boundary conditions for stuff. And like, that's great, good for you. But especially starting out like where I am now, this was incredibly useful. And like now, of course, I can write more elaborately and like really elaborate on the points, both in the bullet points and then the ABCD style intro. But those just helped me immensely in getting all of these out of my head. All right, so this is how I got out of my way and actually started to write. Now it's going quite well, I would say. Obviously, you will hear about it. Maybe it's gonna be a how to write an entire paper after throwing out your draft 1 week before deadline video in the future. Hopefully not. If you are my supervisor. That was a joke. It's going great. And now I'm gonna go back to writing.